Good evening, everyone. Parsha Korach. This last week was my mother, Aleh Shalom, was her yahrzeit. So even though I didn't mention it last week, if I may, I'd like to dedicate this shir in memory of my mother, Aleh Shalom, who in her own quiet way made the people around her very happy. Not just her children, but anybody whom she met. So I also want to tie this week's Parsha of Korach to to last week's Parsha of Shalach. If you recall, last week the premise of the premise of last week's Parsha Shir was that in fact the Parsha of Tzitzit was the logical outgrowth of the tragedy of the spies, because the spies themselves had looked at Eretz Yisrael with a jaundiced view, and I had mentioned in last week's parsha, and it will carry through in this week's parsha, that the concept of Petil Techelet, the concept of the one blue thread in the tzitzit is symbolic of the mystery of the Jewish people's survival and growth. That Rabbi Soloveitchik mentioned that he seldom is more in awe that when he goes to the ocean and stands before the vastness of the ocean, often in blue reflection of the sky above, it is then that he sees the mystery of the universe and the mystery of the Jewish people's survival. And of course, there is a constant, I think, incorrect feeling of tension between science and religion. The two, each, science and religion, each of them tries to explain, to whatever degree possible, a truth of the universe. If you could picture a horizontal line going infinitely in both directions, and then right in the middle, let's put it on a piece of paper, right in the middle, you see a vertical line. That vertical line is the point of creation. To the right of the line, we can put an S for science. To the left of the line, we can put an R for religion, to the left of the vertical line. Because each of them tells us about and helps us to understand the mystery of our universe. The religion seeks to explain to us the why of creation. Science seeks to understand the how of creation. How are things put together? And it does it by taking them apart, by analyzing them. Religion, as Rabbi Menachem, as Rabbi Jonathan Sachs said, religion is the opposite process. It looks at the magnificence of the world as a whole, and then tries to see within it the majesty and the purposefulness of religion itself, of the world itself through religion. So now that mystery, though, again, remember, as represented in the techelet, in the thread of blue, applies to both elements of our exploration and of our seeking truth. One is that of the physical truth in which we live. Rabbi Soloveitchik mentioned that he stands at the sea and you see the vastness of the universe. That's the mystery. We'll never completely understand the vastness and the infinity of the universe itself. And as Rabbi Meir said last week, which I quoted, the very famous quote, that when one looks at the blue of the thread, one contemplates the sea, which is blue, and tchelet. And when one thinks of the tchelet, one thinks of the cosmos, of the heavens. And then when one thinks of the heavens, then they think of the Kisei HaKavod, namely the divine throne. And last week I asked the question, why not just cut to the chase? I'll look at my tzitzis, I'll see the blue thread, and I'll think of the Kisei HaKavod, and I realize that God is creator. The answer is that, or an answer is, that life is never that simple. Understanding truth is not an event. It is a lifelong journey. And we need to look at every element of our lives from the time that we're young and all of the things that we see to lead us, to help us to understand truth. Now, having said that, I would add one more thing. I think the reason that tzitzis is mentioned there, shortly after the tragedy of the Meraglim, of the spies, and just before our Parsha of Korach, is to tell us that the Meraglim, both Meraglim and Korach, had a particular failing. The failing is that they looked at the world only from the standpoint of Lavan, only from the standpoint of that which is rational in the world. And so when the spies went out to see if Eretz Yisrael was conquerable, they didn't have to see if Eretz Yisrael was conquerable. It is conquerable. It was conquerable, but they had to see it through the prism of the blue of the Tchelet. But all they could see was the Lavan, the white, and by all natural, shall we say, even scientific means, the country itself was inaccessible for Jews. Now this week, Korach continues this folly, and he begins the first actual rebellion against Moshe Rabbeinu. Oh, Moshe Rabbeinu had many, gone through many trials and tribulations in the desert, starting with right after Kriyat Yamsuf, they complained. And of course, they had over and over again, there were complaints about water and about food and about being lost. And of course, these are natural, understandable complaints. None of them involved malice. None of them involved a rebellious nature. It was purely that they were afraid. And fear, of course, creates a certain chaotic nature in a person. But here, we see for the first time, and the Ramban actually alludes to this, we see for the first time with Korach, the malicious and pre-thought idea of rebelling against Moshe Rabbeinu. And he had a couple of, what really irked him was the fact that he thought that he should be next in the line to become the Kohen, and he didn't get it. Aaron got it. Remember, Korach was from the same family that from Kahat, which is the son of Levi. So he said there should be something in it for me somewhere. And because he was looking out for number one, so to speak, this led him to begin to try to mount a demagogic rebellion against Moshe. Now, what is a demagogue? A demagogue is a person who unites people under an enemy that he primarily creates. By the way, I think seldom is it she. I don't even know if there's in history we have any evidence of a woman who is a demagogue. If anybody can think of one, or if you think over the week, I would be interested to know. But of course, for us, the two most famous demagogues, three, would be Paro, and in our own time, Hitler, Yimach Shemo v'Zichro, and of course, Korach. Korach engaged in demagogic activity. What does a demagogue do? He unites people around an enemy that is either aggrandized, in other words, the threat of the enemy is just blown out of proportion, or of course doesn't exist at all. That's what Paro was afraid. we see at the beginning chapters of Shemot, Paro was afraid. He was afraid that the Jews would eventually take over the land of Mitzrayim. So he engaged in, first he engaged the people, first his own council, then had them get the people themselves to participate in this horrific act of genocide where children would be murdered at birth. But as the Meforshim say, it didn't happen in one day. The seeds had to be planted because human beings are not naturally inclined to engage in genocidal acts. Now, Korach is upset. And the reason he is upset, one reason is because he thinks he should be next in line. And the second argument is that Moshe Rabbeinu should not be the only arbiter of Jewish law. The Jewish law can not only be determined, but can also be given by just about anybody. Because he says, everybody has a holiness. We know that. Why? Because the Torah said in Shemot, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said that Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh, we would be a nation that is holy. And if that's the case, Moshe Rabbeinu's status should not be above anybody else's. Therein, he betrayed what his real motivations were. It's interesting that the Malbim says to us that really the idea of Kulam Kedoshim is partially correct. We all, the Jewish people, there is a Kedusha which pervades the entire Jewish people. Now, Rav Kook mentions that his view was that there, in every view, just about every view, there is a kernel of truth. And it doesn't matter whether it's communism or socialism or whether it is Musar movement or Hasidim or Reform or conservative. Rav Kook held that there is a kernel of truth in every movement. The trick is to extract the kernel of truth and dispense with that which is inappropriate. And so Moshe Rabbeinu now is faced with Korach, who comes with three distinct arguments. Rashi cites two of them, and the Medrash Shochato gives a third. I want you to see the portrayal of Korach's general argument. The first is he comes, as Rashi says, that he convened his own Sanhedrin, so to speak, of the Bnei Ruvain, and they themselves, of course, are also malcontents because they also feel that they are the descendants of Ruvain, who was the firstborn of Yaakov, and they get nothing. So there is an undercurrent of unhappiness within them to start. And then Korach collects 250 other people who were prominent people, Kri'ei Moed Anshe Shem, people of note, people with reputations joined this. And of course, we know that that's a common tactic to get people who are famous, whether or not they know anything, to espouse a cause. So the first thing that Korach does, according to the Medrash, is that he comes to them and almost mockingly says, listen, you're telling me that there's a mitzvah of tzitzit, which is to have a blue thread on a shirt. So, and then the rest of it can be white. What happens if I have a shirt which is kulot chelet? It's entirely composed of blue threads. Kosher or not? Have I fulfilled the mitzvah or not? Rash and Moshe Rabbeinu says to him, no, you're still chayiv in tzitzis, because it's not the blue. Blue is certainly symbolic, but it is not that which dispenses your responsibility. So of course, Korach says this defies common sense. That's one reason why Rabbi Soloveitchik said that Korach's rebellion, he called it the common sense rebellion. That certainly a part of it is it common sense? If one blue thread is enough to I'm hoping that this, one second. Can you hear me? Let me, I'm sorry. If one blue thread, can you could somebody mention that they hear me? If one hears me, everybody does.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, we hear you.
Thank you. Good.
Yeah, there's no trouble.
Okay, good. There was no trouble. Oh, good. All right. So my screen went off, so I wanted to make sure. All right. So if one blue thread dispenses responsibility, common sense tells you that if the whole garment is so, that you should have fulfilled your responsibility. And then he says, well, I know of another mitzvah, says Korach, the mitzvah of mezuzah. And we all know that the mezuzah, of course, over the generations, there were people, the Samaritans and others who used a different form of mezuzah. But the mezuzah that we accept as a mezuzah has but only 2 parshiot in it, and we put them on the door post, and you can fulfill your responsibility. Korach says, what happens if I have a whole house filled with sforim, with holy sforim? I should certainly have dispensed my responsibility. Once again, he wishes to use common sense, to use logic, to make his point. Moshe Rabbeinu says, no, you could have every sefer that was ever written since the time of, since the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, and that will not fulfill your responsibility. You only fulfill it by this act, the act of obedience. The act of obedience is what makes it a religious act. And I'd like to read from you. I know I'm quoting Rabbi Soloveitchik a lot. Certainly, I'm not going to apologize for that. But he says that a lot of times people can confuse religious fervor, or what we would say a certain sense of joy and intensity with a religious experience. Listen to what he says. The religious experience is autonomous and independent. It follows upon and reflects the deed, not the other way around. To pray and then to dance and sing, yes, that is a religious act. To dance and sing in order to pray, Rabbi Soloveitchik says, no. The Jew must move from action to feeling, not from feeling to action. So, so therefore, this idea of what I feel about something is in itself insufficient to be a truly religious experience. Seeing a single thread of blue within the context of the proper mitzvah produces the great experience. Blue without the mitzvah can produce bizarre, even vulgar reactions and modes of expression. So the key here is not the blue, and the key here is not the library, but rather it is listen to how one should act. Rav Kook himself mentions this at the beginning of Pirkei Avot, when he says the greatest single act that a person can perform is that of listening. He says it is greater than the creation of all the novel interpretations in the Torah, but ultimately, listening is what we are to be doing. So that's why it says in the very beginning of Pirkei Avot, Moshe kibel Torah misina. Moshe received the Torah, received it, but kibel, he was a receptacle. The idea is that it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be creative. Certainly, the Rambam was creative. The Ramban was creative. Rabbi Soloveitchik was creative. The Chama Leibovitz was creative. All of these people are creative, but their creativity is predicated upon listening first. And I think probably one of the saddest elements of our own world today is that we jump straight to creativity. And we sometimes, not sometimes, more often than not, obedience is considered more of a detriment than it is considered to be a benefit. But from a Jewish standpoint, listening is the key. And that's what that Korach missed. Korach comes with a third argument, the demagogue. And by the way, let's take a look at the first two. The first one is based upon fashion. It appeals to people's sense of fashion. Well, I fulfilled it. I've got a completely blue shirt. Or the second one is intellect, that I serve God through intellect. So if one mezuzah with 2 parshiot in it fulfills my religious responsibilities, certainly a whole library and spending my whole life studying, that in itself will fulfill the religious requirements of my life. Not true. Not true. Obedience. The mezuzah is to be the mezuzah, and the tzitzis is to be the tzitzis. Now, Korach comes with a third, classically demagogic approach. He gathers everybody together, and this particular piece that I'm going to share with you is taken from a medrash called the Medrash Shocher Tov. Medrash Shocher Tov is a medrash which is written on Sefer Tehillim, and in this case, the very first psukim of Tehillim begin that Ashrei Ish Asher Lo Alach B'derech Shesheim Lo Amadu Moshav Leitzim Lo Yashav. Right? That the person who has avoided sitting in a Moshav Leitzim, sitting in a group of scorners, but even more than scorners, cynics. I oftentimes say that the difference between a scholar and a cynic is as follows. Both of them ask questions. The scholar asks questions. The cynic asks questions. So what's the difference between them? The difference is the scholar rejoices when he or she receives an answer. The cynic is disappointed because the whole motivation of a cynic is not the seeking of truth, but rather the self-aggrandizement of his own personality and position. So therefore, the Medrash Shocher Tov chooses here the embodiment of the idea of happy is the person, or actually other people say Ashrei means praiseworthy, and Rav Hirsch on that says when you see Ashrei, like Ashrei Yoshev Yisecha, Rav Hirsch says that Ashrei comes from the word Ashur, the heel. And he says Ashrei means forward strides the person who has not sat in the house of the scorners or has not done things which are wrong. So the word Ashrei means forward strides. So in either case, the Medrash tells us the following, that Korach came and assembled all of his people, and of course the demagogue thrives on populism, and he gathers them all and he says, I want you all to hear something. He said, there in my neighborhood, he used the term my neighborhood. Now, you know, the Medrash is certainly sort of exaggerating a bit. There are no neighborhoods, pretty much. And we'll see that many of the mitzvot are yet to be, well, they could be given. They were given in Har Sinai, but they were not necessarily practiced every moment. But here's what he says. There is an almanah, a poor widow in my neighborhood. And she has 2 daughters, and they are yatomot, because obviously their father had died. And she had only 1 field. So she goes to plow the field. What does Moshe say? Lo tacharish b'shor v'chamor. Oh, if you have, I'm going to limit how you can do this. If you only have 2 animals and you need them to pull, then you can't use them. If it's an ox and a donkey, you can't use it. So she said, all right. She goes to harvest the wheat afterwards, however she did it. And then the Torah tells us that you may not, well, she goes to plant. The Torah says you may not plant kilayim, you can't plant two distinct forms of seeds. Once again, a restriction. Then once she goes to harvest, so the Torah tells us that you have to leave certain aspects of your field for other poor people, and so on and so on and so on. And in exasperation, Korach said, you know what she did in exasperation? She went and she bought two lambs. Well, all of a sudden she finds that all the lambs themselves have limitations upon them. Her whole life now, if it's a firstborn, so that one has to go to the Kohen. And then when the animal is shechted, part of it goes to the Kohen, and so on and so on. In exasperation, she says, what can I do? Now, this third argument is not based upon to appeal to people for fashion, nor is it intended to appeal to people who are drawn to intellect. Here, it is what we call a misericordia argument. It is intended to get the feelings of the people to understand, look what Moshe has done. He has created roadblocks to a person's ability to be able to grow and to be able to prosper. Now, let's go back to what Tzitzi does. Tzitzi tells us, Uritemoto, that the objective here is that people are it's a matter of how you see things. If you see, I remember I was once listening to a Chabad Rav, and what he did see was he saw a person who was his neighbor, who apparently was building a building, and he had the movers come in on Shabbos, and he said, to most people, that's an aggravation. To me, a Chabadnik, that's an opportunity. So the same act, it's his opportunity to be able to reach out to another Jew and to be able to express his love for that Jew. And so to Korach, all of the mitzvot are burdens. To people who live the life of Torah, every mitzvah is an opportunity. Some of them are harder. Some of them are easier. But in reality, every mitzvah that we can see is an opportunity. Now, finally, I want to conclude with a Mishnah, which I think most people are familiar with. It's a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, which says, it's in Parak of Pirkei Avot, the 5th chapter, and this is pretty well known. Kol machloket shehi l'shem shamayim. The Mishnah says, listen, Jews, we thrive on machloket. Yeah, we do. We thrive on differences of opinion. But there are, the Mishnah says, 2 differences of opinion. One is the form which is legitimate, and one is just not. Kol machloket shehi l'shem shamayim. Every disagreement, which is actually for the sake of heaven, so falit kayim. In the end, it will endure. Meaning to say, why will it endure? Because both parties are mentioned. The Gemara tells us that we have an obligation to always mention the minority report. If there's a majority, then the minority comes. Why is their view preserved? We don't follow them anyway. The answer is they seek truth. Both sides seek truth. And as Rav Kook says, there is truth in what they say, so it endures. But those disagreements which are not for the sake of heaven, ain't so falit kayim. Ultimately, it is doomed to failure. Now, again, we don't know what it means here is that those disagreements which are based upon trying to seek and understand truth, those will endure. Those that are for the self-development of one person, to feed that person's ego, or on both sides, to feed their egos, that's not going to endure. Ultimately, now there's going to be a winner maybe, and there's going to be a loser, but in the end, probably both parties are losers. And so then the Mishnah says, what is a machloket? Shehi l'shem shamayim. That's Hillel and Shammai. We're going to see in a moment how that plays out, and we're going to conclude with that. V'she'eno l'shem shamayim. What's the classic example of an argument and disagreement which is not intended to get to the truth? It's Korach. And it doesn't say Korach and Moshe. It's Korach va'adato, Korach and his people. Because ultimately, because they were not seeking truth, Each of them came to the table with their own personal intentions and with their own personal desires for themselves. And ultimately, that's a machloket shelo l'shem shamayim. Now, I just want to conclude with a magnificent Gemara in Yevamot. The Gemara in Yevamot, Daf Yud Daled, says the following. Now, Yevamot deals with one of the most intricate of all of our halachot, and that has to do with the marriage. When let's say in the case of Yevamot, a person dies childless, so there's a mitzvah for the widow to marry the brother, but there are so many intricate details of it and ways in which it could work out not well, and it could end up being an avera rather than a mitzvah. So you have an entire Gemara that deals with that. So Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, Shammai and Hillel disagreed on many things in damages and other elements of human life, rituals as well. But here particularly, they disagree on many aspects of marriage, when or where one can marry. So the Brisa says, even though Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagreed on so many marriage issues, can you marry this person? Can't you marry this person? Is she divorced? Is she not divorced? Is she a married woman? Is she not? These are all earth-shattering issues, because if it's a married woman and she doesn't realize it, she could inadvertently commit horrific crimes. And so therefore, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagree, but they say, it says, even though they disagree on so many points regarding both marriage and divorce, lo nimneu Beit Shammai milisa nashim Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai, who very often believed that let's say a woman in certain instances was married and therefore could not marry again to somebody else. And Beit Hillel says no, she could be a free woman, and vice versa. Below Beit Hillel mi Beit Shammai, they did not refrain from marrying within their schools of students. Lamedcha, to teach you. Shechiba v'reut noagim zeh bazeh. That love, chiba is love, and reut and a sense of preciousness existed between them. The kayem ma'ashenemar, to fulfill what is written, ha'emet v'hashalom ehav. Navi, it says that you shall love both emet and shalom, because it's true. Both sides were seeking truth, as opposed to Korach and his group. Both sides sought truth, but both sides also sought and loved the idea of shalom. Ha'emet v'hashalom ehav. That's in Treyaser. You should both love truth and peace. Well, actually, when you think of it, one more thing I would like to add. Who is noted for emet? Moshe emet v'torato emet. Who is the one who is associated with shalom? Aaron. Umitalmidav shel Aaron. Ohev shalom, odev shalom. That Aaron loved peace, pursued peace. Ohev et habriot. First, he had to love people. Umekorvan Torah. Once you love the people, then you can bring them to Torah. So, just to once again review, Korach's problem was he was not seeking truth. He was a demagogue who sought his own personal progress, his own personal pursuit of whatever material or political means there were. Moshe Rabbeinu was the man of truth. Aaron was the man of peace, and ultimately, both Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai embodied the concept of truth and peace. Okay, everyone, have a very good week, and Mi'at Hashem, we'll see you next week, I hope.
Thank you, and your mother's the Shabbat to have in the Leah.
My pleasure. Amen. Thank you.